Hey, so this is part 3 of a series I'm doing on a customer's problematic P320. Today we'll be going over a solution to this gun's heavy trigger pull issue that we covered in the previous videos, and I'll also be talking about the issue itself, going over that really quick again, the fix, and how I believe all of the issues that we saw with this gun actually play into certain characteristics of the P320 that were always present. So it's been about 3 weeks since I came out with my last video, and a lot has happened in the P320 world, the SIG world. First off, we have the FBI report, which Protraband got through FOIA. Massive amount of information was provided in that report. I like to talk about some of the things I found most interesting about it. Just about a week after that, we had the tragic incident with the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command Sergeant. Now, when this story was first reported on July 20th, reports made it sound like it was a uncommanded discharge of the M18 pistol that fatally wounded him. However, just earlier today, we learned that another airman might have been responsible for the shooting, with him apparently being arrested for involuntary manslaughter. I myself am going to reserve judgment until the final report comes out, because any number of outcomes is still possible. Let's see what happens. Now, it goes without saying, for a lot of people out there, this news does not exonerate or vindicate SIG from all of the issues that P320 has been accused of having. Of course, it's a tragedy no matter how you look at it, but the Air Force incident, I think it served as a catalyst in getting more critical eyes on the P320, and here's hoping it'll get us closer into understanding all of its alleged issues. My own perspective for this video will be one of skepticism toward its design. Of course, it's not a controversial take, but I believe the gun has issues. Just a couple days ago, SIG rep Bill Strader went on a live stream to talk about the current affairs of the P320. A lot was covered. It was a long stream at about 3 hours. I think the big takeaway from it was the fact that SIG admits that it cannot find any fault in the P320. Basically, if there was anything wrong with it, we can't find it, is the way Mr. Strader put it. So upon hearing that, I thought, all right then, there's no harm in the public speculating and performing the type of test that it's been doing these past couple weeks, because if SIG can't find anything wrong with the gun, it's on the attention hacking grifters of the internet to do so. Speaking of which, the test that pretty much caught everybody's attention was performed by a YouTuber by the name of Wyoming Gun Project. I thought the test was super interesting. I have my own thoughts on it, and I have a lot of thoughts on the FBI report as well. But before we get to that, I just want to speed through the solution that I found to my customer's gun, which was the main focus of parts 1 and 2 in this video series. If you want to skip this portion of the video, feel free to do so by seeking to the time that you see on the screen right now. If you want to continue watching, that's cool. Kick back. The solution ended up being very simple, and we'll start going through it right now. I want to give a very quick recap of the heavy trigger pull problem. Basically, it made the trigger pull of this P320 extremely heavy, and it made the trigger catch at a very certain hard point that took about 10 pounds to break through. I had took apart and investigated some of the P320's key components, including the sear springs, trigger return spring, trigger itself, takedown safety lever. All of these major components appeared to be untouched, factory, stock OEM. As far as I could tell, the gun mechanically appeared to be stock, save for one part that I totally missed. That part is this eBay special trigger stop bushing that goes over the trigger stop pin. So what happened was, I think I got too caught up with pretty much all the other major components of the 320, and I missed looking over the inconsequential trigger stop pin. This bushing was responsible for that heavy delayed trigger pull that we got. Now, really quick, I gotta say that the comment sections in the previous 2 videos were awesome. Thank you for your kind words, your critiques, and sharing your knowledge on the P320. Many of you are knowledgeable about the platform, and that schooled me about the operation of the P320. Like I said, I'm not a certified SIG armorer, I'm just a lowly shop armorer, and many commenters who are more familiar with the platform than I were nice enough to chime in with thoughts, opinions, and advice that ultimately helped solve this heavy trigger pull issue. Special thanks to these viewers, Red Nez and Ghost, who noticed it when I was going over the FCU. I have no idea if my customer just forgot he had this in there, or maybe I could still believe the issue developed over time. As you can see, the bushing looks well worn, oblong, and maybe not totally cylindrical anymore, and that maybe resulted in the problem becoming more apparent over time as the bushing got smushed by the trigger over time. So I will say that I am ashamed to have missed it, but on the other hand, I am also glad that the problem was this simple, not anything more complicated. And really, it goes to show you, I learned my lesson, that you can't overlook even the smallest things. So with the bushing removed, that heavy stacking trigger pull, the shake wake, and the push apart, the sear drops appear to be gone, which is great. So that's our heavy trigger pull problem solved. And at this point, I would like to explain why I believe this heavy trigger pull issue was directly related to certain characteristics that are present, have always been present, and still are present on many 320s out there, even ones that are brand new. Now, what this bushing ended up doing was sort of amplifying or exacerbating the P320's wall. Now, in the previous videos, I referred to it as the catch point, and it was a catch point because the trigger was being physically stopped, impeded by the bushing being there. Now, with the bushing removed, what it really is just the P320's wall, the typical wall that we all have to break through to get the trigger to break. The bushing impeded the trigger from going back smoothly, and it made the trigger get to a very heavy point that, sort of in a very weird way, fine-tuned the point right before the seer and striker let go of each other. It's what I referred to in previous videos as razor's edge. This point, when the trigger is pulled back to the wall, it really serves as the springboard for what I called bonk awake. Bonk awake is still present on this gun, and believe it or not, it's still present on many P320s out there. To tell you the truth, I thought this was sort of some rare phenomenon, but it seems like many, if not a majority of 320s can have this happen. If you watched Prochaban's FBI files video, he called it the spinal tap. I'll break down the mechanics of it for you. So this is when the trigger is pulled back partially and the striker can be made to drop with the hit or a tap. In the case of that one video that he featured, just a little tap of the slide. Now again, I thought this was some sort of rare phenomenon, but I've seen it demonstrated so many times now. Repeatedly getting the same thing to happen over and over again is very repeatable. Some trigger slack is taken up, a hit, a bonk, or a tap on the top of the slide, and it seems the striker drops very reliably. I tested a brand new off-the-shelf AXG Legion and had the same result. This seems to be typical P320 behavior. Notice the dead trigger I got there. We'll go into detail about this very soon. So I think at this point everybody has seen and is familiar with Wyoming Gun Project's video. He performed a test in where he inserts a screw ahead of the P320 trigger and he is able to make the 320 drop its striker with light manipulation of the slide. I like to spend some time going over WGP's test, what I thought about it, what I thought was interesting, and what I think is maybe not so earth-shattering or game-breaking as some people are thinking it is. I really believe there's still a lot more out there that we need to know, that we need to learn to fully understand the P320's alleged uncommanded discharge issues. I will try to break down the mechanics of what we think is going on as far as UDs or uncommanded discharges go. At the time of recording in early August, no one has come up with a solid, scientific, repeatable method or mode of failure to get the mythical UD to happen, save for one video that sets a UD up and that I think is the best demonstration of a UD that I've seen. Don't worry, we'll cover it in depth as we go on in this video. But before we get into that, I do want to talk more about the WGP test. What did I think about it? Overall, I think the test is valuable because it proves quite a few things. First, it shows us that something other than a trigger pull, literally there is no human input on the trigger. Previous tests that got the P320 seer to drop involved testers physically pulling the trigger back with obviously their trigger fingers. I think my previous two videos in this series were a good example of that. Remember bonk awake and shake awake? And yeah, I fully admit that these tests look dubious, and it was always kind of hard to tell if the tester's finger was pulling the trigger back maybe sympathetically as the hit on the slide was done, or if the striker was truly dropping from the impact of the hit. So yeah, what was happening here? Well, honestly, I think both of these things were happening. While finishing up my testing on the customer's problem gun, I tested a brand new P320 AXG Legion for bonk awake, and yeah, the striker was dropping in the test. So how do I know that on some attempts the impact of the hit was causing the striker to drop and not my finger? Well, here's the thing. On some attempts, the striker safety was actually engaging, resulting in a dead trigger. So the partial trigger pull was defeating the striker safety, but I'm assuming because the trigger didn't get its full travel, the second sear notch came into play and it caught the striker as a safety precaution. Other times, the striker was dropping at full power. There was like a 50-50 chance, full power striker drop or a dead trigger, because one of the P320 safety features was actually doing its job. The customer's X5 Legion was exhibiting the same behavior, and I was just using this P320 XG Legion to check my work to see if this was quote-unquote normal. It seems to be. Again, this was on a factory new AXG Legion, never been fired. So in my mind, you know what this is? I think this is the firing pin lock, aka striker safety lock, once again proving how flaky and unreliable it can be. Around the time I was wrapping up the customer's gun, the FBI test came out, and I was surprised to see that the FBI had similar results to what I was seeing here and to what I was seeing in our previous tests. I thought our problem gun's striker safety and the spring that powers it might have been faulty in some way, but what we saw might have just been par for the course. As we go on, I will talk more about the FBI's findings. I found them super interesting. And of course, I'm going to rant more about the striker safety or firing pin block later. You know I'm going to go off on it. You know how I feel about it. But before I get ahead of myself and do that, let's go back to talking about Wyoming Gun Project's gun. So in the case of his P320, what was crazy to me was it seemed like even a light tap or even just the motion of holstering it was able to set it off. It was remarkable to see how prone to discharge his particular P320 was. I attempted to test myself, but I didn't have a suitable wood screw to replicate it. So I tried to make do with the cut zip tie. It's a very simple test. You're just taking up the slack of the trigger. I figured the zip tie might be a good substitute. So I gave the test a try, and after maybe 200 attempts, I got to make the zip tie preload the trigger in just the right way, and the striker dropped with just a touch of the slide like Wyoming's gun did. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get this on camera, but when it comes down to it, the premise of the test makes sense to me, and I can totally believe WGP's gun had it be so repeatable. Why is that? Well, it plays into my second big takeaway with this test, really. It really showed us how much slop can be present in P320s. Other people that are trying to replicate the test can't, myself included, because whatever parameters allowed for his gun striker to drop so reliably weren't present in most P320s out there. To put it simply, some P320s are just super loose. I myself asked WGP in the comment that you see here, and yeah, I totally agree. Looseness or slop between the slide and frame is a huge factor here. If you remember in my previous test where I was just able to poke the red dot up and get the striker to drop, I believe something similar is happening with what we're seeing in Wyoming's gun. The sear and striker get preloaded into razor's edge mode, and they become extremely susceptible from separating each other with any impact or attempt to split them apart, as far as I can tell. People in my previous video commented how bad the play in my customer's Problem 320 was. Well, WGP's was even worse. In my experience working with P320, selling them on the sales counter, cleaning them, this wild variance that you see in tolerances is what you can expect with the P320. It's par for the course, really. So Wyoming Gun Project's test showed us quite a bit, but I still believe there is a lot out there that we need to find out about the 320's issues. Like what? Well, the go-to argument SIG and its defenders have always stood behind is that the P320 cannot fire without a pull of the trigger. I think it's fair and logical to take it a step further and say it cannot be fired with any manipulation of the trigger. I don't think this is moving the goalpost. Trust me, I'm not a SIG defender at all. I just like to understand what mechanically is going on here. Let me attempt to explain. So let's think about this from a purely mechanical standpoint. That millimeter of trigger movement the screw takes up is huge. Ask any engineer. A millimeter is a lot to account for in a system like this. That whole mill of movement accounts for a lot that happens in the P320's firing sequence. It raises the striker safety lever in the FCU, which defeats the striker safety, and prepares the sear to begin to drop the striker, beginning its travel downward. We also need to take into account the amount of weight that's behind the trigger pull to even get to this point where the striker is able to drop. It feels maybe about like 1 to 2 pounds. You understand what I'm getting at? Accounting for that entire millimeter of movement takes a solid amount of effort. If you're thinking that millimeter of travel can easily be explained with like gunk in the trigger, well, carbon caking can get pretty thick and get pretty nasty. As armor, trust me, I know. But to have enough of that gunk that it clears all that preload, well, I find that very hard to believe. We can't believe that all P320s that have UD'd, allegedly, had more than a millimeter of gunk or maybe a rock jammed in the trigger. And yes, before anybody comments, I am aware that the biggest thing you can take away from Wyoming's test is a light tap of the slide was letting the striker drop, and that should not be happening. I'm fully aware of this. That still doesn't change the fact that the preload, all that preload is being taken up by a screw. That preload is a lot to account for. That's the main point I want to make here. So yeah, those are pretty much all my thoughts on Wyoming Gun Project's test. It was an eye-opening test that caught a lot of people's attention, but obviously it's not the smoking gun we're looking for. I believe getting a UD to happen without any manipulation of the trigger at all is our big goal here. You know what GBRS thinks about this? If the gun doesn't go off with the guy having his arms crisscross applesauce, I don't want to hear it. This is the thing that needs to be figured out for the sake of the Netflix documentary. Okay, so let's move on. So let's theory craft possible scenarios where that preload is being taken up not by a screw or finger pulling the trigger back, but something internal in the FCU that is causing that preload to be taken up internally, thus setting up a uncommanded discharge scenario. Now, it is widely suspected that UDs are happening without the pull of the trigger or any manipulation of the trigger at all. That's right, crisscross applesauce. Let's also consider the fact, and this is a big one, that manual safety models like the M17 and M18 totally lock the trigger from being moved at all. With the manual safety on, there's no way for pre-travel in these guns to be taken up. We can't stick a screw in front of the trigger if the trigger locks us out from doing so, But of course, we know uncommanded discharges with the military guns are still allegedly occurring across all the armed forces, Marines, Air Force, and Army. Something else must be going on here, and it's something big. Let's fire from the hip with more theories. I think there is a entirely possible scenario of a total failure of the striker and sear. This is where they outright slip away from each other with no millimeter of pre-travel to be cleared at all. I think the total failure theory is worth considering. It's valid, in my opinion. Guys, I know I'm basically repeating the same thing over and over again, but I cannot stress the importance getting an understanding of what mechanisms are at work here. Maybe some of you are visual learners. I hope this next portion of the video will help you visualize what's going on here. Take a look at the way each component of the SCU moves with the trigger pull. Some people are suspecting poor tolerances between all of the parts that ride on the sear axle pin, which includes the sear, striker safety, and disconnector. People are theorizing slot between these parts, or the complete opposite is happening. Maybe gunk is jamming, is getting in between each part of this sandwich and preventing each part from doing its respective job. That sounds logical to me. See, this is where the FBI's super high-tech, high-speed X-ray camera would be useful. So now we get the premise of how a theoretical major failure of the P320's firing sequence might play out. Cool thing is, you don't have to continue to listen to me and my poor attempts in trying to explain how one of these failures might happen, because this video by Joey Russo shows exactly that. It is the only video that I have ever come across that features a clear example of a uncommanded discharge, totally without manipulation or elimination of pre-travel on the trigger. As of early August 2025, I believe Mr. Russo's video offers us the best explanation, the best simulation of how a UD can occur. No partial trigger pull, no manipulation of the trigger whatsoever. Rather, just a impact on the slide and a totally trigger pull-less discharge. And it was published to YouTube 3 whole months ago. It is highly underviewed, and I want to bring some attention to it. I will attempt to explain the results of Mr. Russo's test, but I highly suggest that you check out his video yourself. Now, before you get excited with me hyping it up like this, I did mention the P320 was compromised. Yeah, some of you might view Mr. Russo's test and think the amount of stops that he had to pull to get that P320 to discharge completely invalidates his test as a whole. That's understandable, and for a while I thought the same. Now, there are quite a few caveats to how Joey got his 320 to discharge, but for every one of those caveats, for every one of those elephants in the room, I believe there are practical explanations as to how each of them might occur in the real world in everyday use. I'll go through each and every one of them, and I'll explain why I think this is the closest thing we've had to a smoking gun in this entire P320 UD case thus far. Let's begin. So the first thing to talk about is the fact that his P320 was worked over by a gunsmith who gave it a trigger job. We should note that the gunsmith wasn't just any bubba, but rather the work was done by a skilled, competent gunsmith known for his work on the P320. To ensure the nicest, lightest trigger, the sear and striker surfaces had been slicked up very well, and they're now being powered with lighter match type springs. Very common thing to do in trigger jobs in general, not only just on the P320. Most of the time when it comes to trigger jobs, you may have a sear and striker that are super slicked up. They give you a nice trigger pull. However, because the sear and striker surfaces are being honed and sharpened up, this also results in less contact between those two parts in general. So what's the real world explanation for this? A gun ain't gonna give itself a trigger job out of nowhere, can it? Well, I think you'd be surprised. You know, there's a funny little philosophical joke question in gunsmithing that goes, what is a trigger job other than accelerated normal use or accelerated normal wear, something like that? Sure, the two surfaces were worn on purpose. Sure, the spring rates of those competition type springs were lighter than stock. Well, there's an easy, real world practical explanation for this. Springs wear out over time, they take a set and purposely get shorter as they're used. How about the slicked up sear and striker surfaces? Well, at this point, I want to begin to talk about the FBI report and its investigation of the Michigan State Police M18, which supposedly had a confirmed uncommanded discharge. This gun, with supposedly only 1,300 rounds through it, but had gnarly looking sear and striker surfaces. You know, it's kind of funny. The FBI's BRI, or Ballistic Research Institute, has some of the most high-tech tools and equipment to analyze something like this. But what's funny is you didn't need an X-ray camera or HD microscope to see the crazy looking shape of that striker foot. Of course, it's supposed to be flat, but look at how gnarly that ski ramp of a striker foot that gun had. I've heard the theory that that ramp might have actually been a result of poor manufacturing or poor metal injection molding. Thus you have that streak of metal jutting out like that. Must have been 5 o'clock on a Friday when Indomim pumped that one out. Coincidentally, it must have been another 5 o'clock on a Friday when SIG QC let that one pass. I don't know which case would be worse. Parts prematurely wearing at only 1,300 rounds, or QC so low that a malformed component like that gets into a production gun that gets shipped to a police department. Could imperfections in parts like that account for building tolerances that can take up the pre-travel of the trigger? In my opinion, no. I'll tell you what I think is more likely here. I think the FBI more or less alludes to this. It's that a messed up striker foot like that will very easily damage both contact surfaces of the striker and sear over time. Thus, we had a total failure, a total slippage between the two. And let's not forget, this was a naturally occurring failure. A gunsmith didn't have to slick up the sear and striker on the MSP gun because that ski ramp was maybe only making like at most maybe 70-80% of contact on the sear. With reduced striker and sear contact like that, you don't need a trigger job. But supposedly the thing was pulling like 6 or almost 7 pounds, so yeah. So that ski ramp slope of a striker foot was plain to see with the naked eye. But I'll tell you one thing that wasn't, and this is where the FBI's access to super high-tech, super high-speed cameras come in handy. Now I'm about to tell you one of the most single interesting things I found in the FBI report. Apparently, while examining the P320's cycle of operations in actual live fire, they found that the sear was bouncing up and down, and it was grinding, gritting against the striker foot, which the FBI suspected was also a cause of accelerated wear between the two parts. Now you would think the sear being powered by two clicky pen springs would prevent against this bounce, but apparently not. So I would say the main thing to take away here is that severe wearing of the sear and striker absolutely can happen in the real world, whether it's through natural, normal use and high mileage, or as a result of poorly QC'd parts that can damage and highly accelerate the wear between these two vital parts. Okay, so that covers the question of the compromised striker and sear surfaces. Alright, the next thing that we have to talk about is the fact that Mr. Russo simulated heavy fouling around certain key areas of the firing sequence of the P320, which include the sear area and the ever so reliable striker safety lock. Mr. Russo applied heavy fouling around these areas. The fouling that he applied might look pretty severe, to put it lightly. That said, I'd argue that simulated fouling might not be so far off than from what you would see in real life, perhaps through heavy use without cleaning or operating the gun in austere conditions. Let's make note of the heavy fouling on the striker safety area. If you ask me, the striker safety system, the firing pin block system of the P320, doesn't need to be nearly as fouled as we see it here to fail in doing its job. That job, of course, is to prevent errant striker drops. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you know how I feel about it. Why SIG went with this micro torsion safety spring design while every other manufacturer opts for a simple solid block powered by a simple coil spring is anybody's guess. And you know what? I'll make a guess right now. It's probably to save a few bucks in the machining process. They probably thought that having the firing pin block attached to the firing pin itself so it can be made in one unit. This would save them valuable machine time, save them on bits that would be needed to drill the channel for a traditional type firing pin block to be implemented. There's all of that, and I also think there is the pride of making a system, a new system, a novel system that works. It looks like you're not copying block like everybody else is. I bet during the time of the P320's conception, at this time SIG knew the P250 was a flop, and maybe the team felt that they really needed to think outside the box while saving money. The team had to raise a phoenix out of the ashes, retrofitting a new, nearly fully cocked striker design into the previous DAO architecture or framework. And that architecture wasn't terrible. You had the FCU system, which probably wouldn't have existed without Steyer setting the blueprint, but we won't talk about that. Now, would you say this foray into attempting to make a new firing pin block system was worth it? I don't know. But yeah, this is my best guess as for why the firing pin block on the P320 is the way it is. And it is fallible in so many ways. I mean, in the FBI test, when they did an x-ray of the 320 firing, the little torsion safety spring thing was moving in blowback of the slide. What in the world? And on that note, another interesting thing I found with the FBI test is that they also had light primer indents when they attempted to do the sear press test with the MSP pistol. They also tested it with a brand new M18, and apparently they had a primer detonate within 2 attempts with the striker safety lock spring intact. I can only say it in so many ways. The firing pin block system on this gun, it's a bad actor. SIG, I can see what you were trying to do. I gotta give you props for trying to design out of the box. But when it comes to something so important like a firing pin block, I mean, this is your last defense in catching a runaway striker on your fully cocked striker-fired pistol. There should be no substitute for systems or a system that just plain works. There's absolutely no need to try and reinvent the wheel with something like this. Sorry for the rant, but I just want to continue talking more about service pistols and their general design philosophies. So if you know anything about mass-issued service-type pistols that militaries and police departments use, you know that they are often used hard and put away wet. Armorers or like those in charge of a gun's maintenance are not always proactive in their care and maintenance, which leads to accelerated wear. Burnt carbon and propellant deposits mixed with gun lube make sort of a lapping compound that will do a number real quick on guns' tolerances. These service type guns never come super tight, precision built out of the factory. They're usually always made with a little bit of play to them, because guns with slightly looser tolerances, ones that are designed with more generous clearances between all the parts in mind, well, that comes with a lot of benefits. You'll get more reliable operation when the gun is getting dirty, better reliability in harsh environments, easier parts compatibility across guns in a fleet, a lot of benefits. As long as all critical parameters of a pistol's parts are within spec, there's nothing wrong with a gun that's a little bit loose. Now here's the thing, this might not actually be the case with the P320. If we assume loose tolerances as one of the key factors that contribute to these alleged uncommanded discharge issues, well, consider the fact that P320s can come off the assembly line pretty darn loose. Whatever clearances SIG deems acceptable for these things, well, they must be pretty lenient. This pistol that you're seeing, this is a new never fired M17 made in late 2024. Look how loose it is out of the box. Look, I don't really think it's that important that your P320 is tighter than this. I don't care. The thing is, we should pay attention to the fact that SIG found that slop that you see here acceptable and ready to ship out. You know, doing the sock puppet thing that Moist Critical Charlie said, that's an appropriate comparison. We see a lot of vertical movement, and this vertical movement may be playing a part, especially when compounded with other issues, on why these guns might be letting their strikers drop uncommanded. So let's take this M17 that's already pretty loose out of the box. Let's put it through the ringer. Let's put it through 25,000 rounds with minimal maintenance. At the end of that test, it'll be a rattle can by the end of that. Now, knowing what we know about the P320, all of its potential flaws, do you think it'd be unreasonable to propose the idea that the increased slop of these guns as they get used might be actually detrimental to safe operation? You know what? I really hate to even think about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more and more incidents with these guns as time goes on. This is all hypothetical, of course, but I hope you see where I'm coming from. I don't mean to be a fearmonger. So yes, outwardly, just by handling the P320, we know that they can be pretty loose, especially on the y-axis, which is the most concerning thing to me. Okay, now you have to wonder what's going on underneath the hood though. No, I'm sure there's nothing to worry about because SIG has some of the highest standards for metal injection molding in the industry. The design itself is extremely smart, and the best thing is it's 100% made in America. Now they'd love for you to believe all of that, but it's time for a reality check. Remember the Michigan State Police gun with messed up striker foot. Remember the fact that P365 trigger return springs keep breaking. Take into consideration all of these cheap to produce metal injection molded parts, those that are MIM'd in India and not checked for quality when they get to New Hampshire, make their way into production pistols. With the P320, we have a pistol designed with loose tolerances in mind, sure, but yet it may not tolerate austere conditions like a typical loose service pistol would. For example, look at its backplate. Is there any reason why there is such a huge gap between the backplate cover and the frame? In between that space, we have open access to the sear. This is how people have always been doing the sear drop test, poking the sear directly. The sear and striker surfaces are the most important pair of parts in the gun, and they are basically exposed to the elements. And we thought the Beretta's open slide design was bad. Speaking of the M9, could you imagine what getting caught in a Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq sandstorm would do to a P320? That moon dust will find its way in there and wreak havoc on the sear, the striker, along with every other piece that rides on the sear axle pin. Let's not forget the striker safety. Suddenly that test with Mr. Russo purposely fouling up the system doesn't seem so unrealistic. Actually, you know what? I don't think we know how the M17 and 18 perform in dusty, sandy environments, because phase 2 of the MHS trial testing, which probably would have tested for stuff like this, was never completed. The most tested pistol of all time, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, let's get back to Mr. Russo's test. This is going to be the last point, the last caveat that we need to cover. So, one very important factor that we can't ignore about Joey's test was that his test gun was a pre-voluntary upgrade P320. But like he mentions in the video, and this is something I've always thought myself, SIG never recalled those. They call it a voluntary upgrade. It's in the name. It was always an optional thing, and because it wasn't an actual recall, we should be able to consider those 2014 to 2016 guns still totally safe. It shouldn't matter whether the post-voluntary upgrade guns are actually safer than the pre-voluntary upgrade ones. The pre-voluntary guns are still totally safe. If they weren't, SIG, of course, would have issued a mandatory recall for all of these guns. Let's do a quick rundown of all the changes SIG implemented in their voluntary upgrade program, and I'll explain why I don't think any of the changes made, except for one, are really relevant to our ongoing UD issue. In any case, pre-upgrade or post-upgrade, it shouldn't matter, because SIG's official stance on this is that both variations of the P320 are totally safe. Let's blaze through them real fast. Well, we'll blaze through the simpler ones, but we'll talk about the one I find most interesting a little bit more in depth. First one, and probably the most obvious visually, is the trigger, which looks like it went through a few cycles of Ozempic. SIG found that reducing the weight of the trigger prevented the inertial trigger pulls that would happen when you dropped the original P320. The second thing SIG implemented was the addition of the disconnector and the corresponding notch in the slide to accommodate it. This helped the P320 from having out of battery discharges. Apparently that still happens though. I'm surprised there wasn't a disconnector in the original design. My guess this was an oversight coming from the P250. You can't double tap a DAO very quick, but you could with a single, basically SAO type trigger. Finally, the last change implemented by SIG in the voluntary upgrade is their linking of all the parts in the firing sequence all together. This, by far, was the most interesting change they opted to implement, and of course there's no mention of it on the voluntary upgrade webpage. There was quite a bit of chatter about this change, because when people first started doing the sear press test, because all parts were linked, pressing down on the sear also moved the trigger back to the rear. And I want to take the time to mention that I found it very interesting that the FBI relied on the striker drop test, striker press test, as a testing protocol. I have seen the argument, and some commenters made this argument in the comment section in previous videos, that the sear press counts as a trigger pull because all parts of the firing sequence are linked together. You got the trigger bar, and the sear all moving together as one because they are linked mechanically. When you press down hard on the sear, the trigger moves back, I would say sympathetically. It completes its travel all the way back, therefore also defeats the striker safeties. Prior to the voluntary upgrade program, they were all not interlinked like this before in the original P320 design. So yes, about the sear press being counted as a trigger pull, you know what? I now better understand that perspective after reading some of your comments. My original perspective was because the sear was the sole part being actuated upon with my press, it was the part that was solely responsible for getting that striker to drop. Yes, with the sear press, through the hard press of the sear, yes, the trigger is getting its full rearward travel back. Thus, you can maybe argue that it's being pulled. I can understand how mechanically linking all the parts together would serve as some sort of additional safety against striker drops. Preloading each part with all the full weight and the force of all the springs going on, I can see how that serves as additional safety. Now, on the other hand, looking at things more from a critical perspective, like what we saw with 3 P320s in a trench coast test, like the only reason why the P320 is going off in the first place now with the sear press test is because the parts of the firing sequence are interlinked now. So yes, this interlinking of the firing sequence really complicates things, and I'm just going to say that I still don't believe that pressing down the sear equals pulling the trigger. That's just my opinion, and my opinion shouldn't matter much. I mean, I'm the idiot who completely missed that eBay special trigger stop bushing. So all of that being said, that concludes my analysis of Mr. Russo's simulated uncommanded discharge test. A big thanks to you, Mr. Russo. Now, some of you might have watched this video and then watched mine and you still think the test is worthless. You know what? That's fine. But we should be open to the idea that maybe at least some of the things he did in that test might set us on the right path at understanding how UDs can happen. In any case, It is the only video with a trigger pull-less discharge, trigger manipulation-less discharge that I've seen in a proper test, not through CCTV or body cam footage like we're so used to seeing, and I think that's worth something. Whatever happens, I just hope that one day we will eventually know the truth and be able to put this P320 UD situation behind us. That'll be the day it actually ends. Alright guys, so we're almost at the 40-minute point. And it's at this point of the video I want to start to conclude this problematic SIG series. I started these videos wanting to showcase my experience on working on the customer's P320, and eventually it became a goal of mine to spread the word and maybe help better inform people about what might be going on with these guns. Honestly, I wanted to conclude this series a few weeks ago, but the SIG news just kept on coming, and there was just so much to talk about day after day. Currently, in this first week of August, I think the big thing everybody's waiting for is the Air Force Global Strike Command's official incident report that'll give details on the passing of the airman. That's the big one. Aside from that, there are so many things happening in the P320 sphere on a day-to-day basis. One I really want to comment on is SIG's recent blog post where they purposely switched up their verbiage. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. That post just pissed me off. They went from saying the P320 cannot fire unless the trigger is pulled to the P320 cannot fire unless the trigger is moved to the rear. Man, in what other direction can a trigger be pulled? Come on. Hey, I got a quick tinfoil hat conspiracy theory for you. Do you think SIG linking all the firing sequence parts together was ultimately done to play into this whole trigger being pulled to the rear thing? Knowing what tactics SIG are capable of, how low they're willing to stoop, I wouldn't put it past them, but thankfully, if UDs are happening, allegedly, no pull of the trigger, no movement of the trigger at all is required. At least that seems the case, but it made me think. Look, never give this company the benefit of the doubt. Never give any company the benefit of the doubt, but especially not this one. It's funny that they're accusing the public of using lawfare tactics, but they're the ones trying to set up all the legal defenses that they can at this point. Folks, this is a move done by a company that knows it's in deep shit. And day by day, more just keeps on coming out. For example, that MHS criticality report, it's a big one. Biggest takeaway from it, of course, is that SIG knew that the P320 was prone to discharge when impacted as early as February 2017, 6 whole months before the voluntary upgrade. Excellent work to Practical Shooting Insights and Shade Tree Armorer for uncovering that report. Well, folks, it's about time we finally wrap this up. If you're interested in this whole SIG situation that SIG finds itself in now, I want to recommend to you a video that I think you'll really enjoy. The video is by Dick Fairburn. He's been in the industry for more than 40 years, and his recent video, SIG P320, An Unfolding Disaster, really gets into the lore of SIG. If you know who Ron Cohen is, I thought I did. I just knew him as the guy who ruined Kimber, then moved to SIG, built it up, but is also responsible for its downfall that we are actively seeing live right now. Before watching Dick's video, I had no idea he came from a metal injection molding background. He owned a company called Jericho Precision. I have never heard any of this before. Very interesting. And it explains a lot. Hey, if anybody knows, is Cohen responsible for shutting down SIG Germany, SIG Sauer GmbH? Like, I know he was the mastermind in getting the German plant to produce those SP 2022 pistols bound for Colombia, which the German government caught on to. Does anybody know if that was the straw that broke the camel's back for the German branch to shut down? If you do know, please leave a comment. So anyway, back to Mr. Fairburn's video. It's pretty much a comprehensive Dark Souls lore video just on SIG Sauer. It's a must-watch. Appreciate Mr. Fairburn's insights on what could be going wrong with SIG. He makes a great point. If SIG actually knew what was going on with the P320, they would have implemented a fix by now. You know, I can't help but laugh at that, but heck, it's probably true at this point. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.